We often idealize the spread of Christianity into the Mediterranean world. Believers cheer the apostles on and are thrilled with the heroic exploits of Paul and Barnabas. They smile when a new city, overseas province, or continent is seeded for salvation. But the first Christian Pentecost was not followed by one prolonged glory story. Aside from the spectacular extension of the church, the book of Acts and Paul's letters very honestly, very realistically also record the instances of smallness and pettiness among the apostles, the squabbles between missionaries, the jealousies, and the early church members, and to be sure, the theological controversies that raged then even as they do today. All was not sweetness and light. Some of the problems were economic. We recall how the Jerusalem apostles had to appoint a board of deacons to take care of the needs in the early Christian social ministry at Jerusalem. Some of the poor church members in Palestine also seem to have been in continuing financial straits. The Jerusalem leaders mentioned this problem to Paul during one of his visits to the Holy City. Several times, Paul and his associates delivered relief money to the elders there.
Perhaps some unwise collectivistic experiments by the Jerusalem Christians may have been responsible. But then, too, the Near East was periodically hit by famine and disease. Life was never easy in this part of the world, nor, for some people, is it today.
But far more important issues were confronting the early church, a big theological problem in particular. Among the Jerusalem Christians, there was a group of very strict interpreters of the Jewish law. They were called the Circumcision Party, or the Judaizers, people who even attacked Peter for daring to eat with his Gentile convert in Caesarea, the centurion Cornelius. "Why did you go and eat with uncircumcised men and women?" they demanded. Although Peter's reply satisfied them for a time, the narrow-minded legalists now dispatched representatives to Antioch.
There they announced that the only way a Gentile could become a Christian was to become a Jew first. "Unless you were circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved," they thundered. Despite the coming of Christ, they argued, Old Testament law still applied, also to Christians, in its entirety.
Paul and Barnabas fought this notion vigorously. If the Judaizers were right, their entire mission effort in Cyprus and Asia Minor would have been undermined. They hadn't required their Gentile converts in that journey to be circumcised or to uphold Jewish law, since salvation was achievable not through the law, but only through faith in Jesus Christ.
A debate raged among the Christians in Antioch, the Judaizers demanding the law, Paul arguing for the freedom of the gospel. The church at Antioch finally sent Paul, Barnabas, and Titus to Jerusalem to consult with the apostles on so basic an issue.
Titus was one of Paul's Greek converts, most probably from Antioch. And he had not been circumcised. In other words, here was a walking, breathing test case on the theological question. Was Titus a genuine Christian as he was, or would he have to become a Jew first?
Exactly when the three arrived in Jerusalem is not known, nor where they met the leaders of the church. Certainly somewhere in this panorama of the holy city today, perched on its mesa across from the Mount of Olives. Jerusalem rises above the brook Kidron, with the golden dome of the rock most likely marking the place where the temple originally stood. The city walls were rebuilt by the Turkish Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent in the 16th century.
The meeting between Paul, Barnabas, Titus, and the Jerusalem apostles would become the first church council in Christian history, and probably its most important. It was called the Apostolic Council, or the Council of Jerusalem. And if its decision had gone the other way, Christianity might not have become a world religion.
Three pillars of the church, as they were called, were in charge: Peter, James, and John. But this James was not John's brother. He had been executed by King Herod Agrippa. This James was James the Just of Jerusalem, Jesus' half-brother, the eldest son of Joseph and Mary, who was born next after Jesus. He became the leader of the Jerusalem Christians and virtually the first bishop of the Christian church.
The delegation from Antioch was given a warm reception at the Jerusalem Council. Then Paul stood up and opened the proceedings by giving a sample of the sort of gospel he had been preaching to the Gentiles. Quote, "In order to make sure that I was not running or had not run in vain," as he later put it so poignantly. If he had proclaimed a wrong gospel, his 15 years of study and mission work would have been utterly wasted.
Paul's theology sat well with everyone but the Judaizers, who insisted adamantly, and like a broken record, it is necessary to circumcise the Gentiles and to order them to keep the law of Moses. A drone of discussion filled the room. But now Simon Peter stood up and fully supported Paul's theology. The genial fisherman reminded the council of how God had elected the Gentiles also, as witness his own special mission to Cornelius. Paul and Barnabas then reviewed how extraordinarily God had blessed their efforts in Asia Minor. Would he have given them power to perform miracles there if they had been preaching a wrong gospel?
Now that was a good argument. James now showed his leadership by bringing the council to a decision. He stood up and made the following momentous statement: "My brothers, I have reached the decision that we should not trouble those Gentiles who are turning to God." He was siding with Peter, Paul, and Barnabas. "But we should write to the Gentiles to abstain only from things polluted by idols, and from fornication, and from whatever has been strangled, and from blood." Paul's message of freedom won out. Paul's preaching was authentic. Gentiles could come directly into Christianity without having to stop at a kind of Jewish halfway house first. Titus could stay as he was. And the 4 restrictions cited by James were mild tokens asked of the Gentiles so as not to offend their Jewish fellow Christians. The Council at Jerusalem had clearly opted for salvation by God's grace through faith rather than salvation by the works of the law, a momentous precedent for the future of the church. It's one of the reasons that Christianity today has 100 members for every Jew. Gentiles could come directly into the faith. As Paul would shortly write to the Galatians,
"We did not submit to the Judaizers for even a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might always remain with you."
Paul's victory was confirmed by a letter that the elders of the Jerusalem church wrote to the congregation in Antioch, and it was delivered by special emissaries. Paul and Barnabas had not run in vain. The gospel of God's free grace in Christ was good news, great news indeed. Because of Paul's obvious success with the Gentiles, a division of labor had been agreed upon at the Apostolic Council. James, Peter, and John would concentrate primarily on a ministry to Jewish Christians, whereas Paul and Barnabas would specialize in Gentile mission work. Now, one would have thought that the Judaizers would have accepted their defeat gracefully at the Jerusalem Council and even recognized God's expansive arms in welcoming all races and nationalities into his kingdom. But never underestimate the fanaticism of narrow minds.
incredibly, the Judaizers still tried to advance their cause, and a party of them returned here to Antioch to continue their nasty activities in dividing the church. Peter happened to be paying a visit to the Christians at Antioch also, and he had had no scruples about dining with the Gentile converts there, as Paul and Barnabas had been doing for many months. But when the Judaizers showed up, he stopped this table fellowship with the Gentile Christians to forestall any criticism from the militantly Orthodox.
Peter was very inconsistent here, and what's worse, his attitude grew contagious. Soon even Barnabas and other Jewish Christians at Antioch were also dining on a strictly kosher basis, leaving Gentile believers by themselves and very offended, understandably offended. Who knows? Maybe Peter felt that his mission, now mainly to Jews, required such conduct.
but it remains a sad step backwards in an otherwise great ministry. A throwback to the Peter of pre-Pentecost days. Paul wouldn't take it, and he quickly set Peter straight.
As he later wrote the Galatians,
I opposed him to his face because he stood self-condemned. When I saw that they were not acting consistently with the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews?
the truth of the gospel was at stake, and Paul would not let Peter risk it for any reason whatever. Peter seems to have taken the admonition in a Christian spirit. But such a scene suggested in this early gilded glass was absolutely extraordinary. One of the two greatest apostles castigating the other, and in public no less. This used to bother some of the later church fathers like Jerome, who tried to explain away this scene as a bit of stage acting between Peter and Paul, a little morality play to show Christians how to resolve their difficulties. For surely the two greatest apostles loved and respected each other. But another great church father, Augustine, thought the quarrel between the two absolutely genuine, and he was right. Paul wouldn't have written as he did if this were just a charade.
And this was not the only apostolic squabble. Just after the Paul versus Peter spat comes another shocker. Paul and his colleague Barnabas have a celebrated falling out. The two had agreed that it was time to revisit the new churches in Asia Minor and what would be known as the second mission journey, and Barnabas wanted to take his cousin John Mark along. Paul, however, would have none of that. He didn't want Mark to come along because he had deserted them in Asia Minor and had not cooperated in the mission effort. Was Paul getting legalistic himself or unforgiving? Maybe he was just being realistic. The kind of demanding expedition they were undertaking required total commitment and absolute reliability. Barnabas refused to back down, and it actually led to a split between the two apostles. Perhaps their relationship had already been frayed by Barnabas' weakness in the face of the Judaizers at Antioch. But good can come out of evil. The net result of the apostolic altercation was 2 mission expeditions instead of just one.
Barnabas now took John Mark on a separate mission journey to Cyprus again, while Paul chose a new partner named Silas for his planned journey to Asia Minor. Silas had helped deliver the letter of decision from the Jerusalem Council to the church at Antioch.
To learn about such quarreling and controversy among the earliest believers is not at all embarrassing to the cause of Christianity. There's something very refreshing about the realism and candor of these episodes. Saints are sinners too. They're also prone to failure and error, and their story is so much more believable when it is told in full. Other records from antiquity are loaded with fulsome flattery of their subjects, and therefore lose a lot of credibility. The Bible, on the other hand, is the one book in ancient literature which admits that its heroes are sinners too, and then provides a candid look at the sins. So instead of glossing over any faults or frailties, squabbles or quarrels, Luke's record in the book of Acts and the letters of Paul report them all with bracing honesty. Another reason that such scenes were included in the biblical record may have been to comfort future generations of Christians. If in the ruddy glow of the first Pentecost, the early church, inspired by the Holy Spirit, could still become such a cockpit of controversy between liberals and conservatives, parties and other groups, well, then there's some consolation for later generations of Christians which have done and are doing the same thing.
Paul had emerged from the theological conflict unscathed. The Jerusalem apostles and the Christians at Antioch recognized that his grasp of the gospel was not only powerful, but correct. His own chief concern, however, was not to gloat over his correction of Peter or Barnabas, but for the spiritual health of the Jewish and Gentile converts he had won on the first mission journey. It was high time to revisit the young churches he had founded in Galatia. One reason is that the die-hard Judaizers were making a last determined effort to undermine his message in the Galatian churches. When Paul learned of it, he promptly wrote his most impassioned letter to the Galatians. After the briefest introduction, Paul continues with some powerful Greek. Let's hear a line or two of it in the language in which he originally wrote it. Thaumazo, hote hutos tacheos, metatitheste, apo tu kalesantos himas in charite Christo, eis heteron evangelion.
I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another gospel, but there are some who are confusing you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should proclaim to you a gospel contrary to what we proclaim to you, let that one be cursed.
Following this scolding, however, Paul continued writing a magnificent document which has well been called the Magna Carta of Christian Liberty, a noble affirmation of the doctrine of justification by God's grace through faith alone.
It was probably spring in the year 50 that Paul and Silas began the second mission journey, and they reached their destination by land rather than by sea. They started overland northward, first to Paul's hometown, and then across the formidable Taurus mountain chain. Their journey from Tarsus certainly began on this very highway, the newly excavated Cardo, or main north-south roadway in Tarsus, a marvel of careful engineering. After many thousands of footsteps, they soon reached the low, arid foothills of the Taurus Mountains, but their trek grew more demanding as they climbed on. Paul and Silas must have been awestruck at the majestic panorama of God's creation along the mountain passes that cut through the snow-capped Taurus range. They were heading for the most famous pass of antiquity, the Cilician Gates. The gates are a series of sharp defiles that penetrate the otherwise impregnable Taurus barrier for a distance of 10 miles. At one point, the gates taper down to a narrow, precipitous pass that resembles a cramped canyon. Since this photograph, which was taken 40 years ago, the Turks have widened the pass for a modern highway. Paul and Silas would doubtless have stopped here to gather in the full significance of this gap. These were the narrows on the aorta of the ancient world, through which pulsed the great armies of the past. Hittite, Assyrian, Persian, Greek, and Roman forces had all marched through that very pass. Xerxes, Cyrus, Xenophon, and Alexander the Great had all used the Cilician Gates for military conquest. But now a lonesome pair of missionaries were using the same pass for a spiritual conquest that would have far more permanent results. Once on the higher Anatolian plateau, they turned westward to revisit the 4 Galatian cities where Paul had preached some months earlier and delivered to them the decision of the Jerusalem Council. At Lystra, Paul was so impressed with a young convert named Timothy that he invited him to join their mission effort as a co-worker. He eagerly accepted. With a Jewish mother and a Greek father, Timothy was a personal symbol of the universality of the faith. He was young, to be sure, but he would become a great help to Paul. After moving on to Iconium and Antioch, Paul, Silas, and Timothy planned to travel on westward into the Roman province of Asia. Instead, the 3 now turned northwestward toward the Dardanelles.
Having been kept by the Holy Spirit from speaking the word in Asia, according to the account in Acts, does this mean that God was playing favorites with the gospel? No, it was all a matter of timing. Paul would certainly visit the province of Asia and its principal city, Ephesus, for 3 years during his 3rd mission journey. But for now, the continent of Europe was awaiting his message.
After some days, they reached the Aegean coast at Troas, very near the site of ancient Troy at the mouth of the Dardanelles. Not that much is left of the once impressive city here, which was called Alexandria Troas, but these slender arches, amazingly still intact, seem to bridge the time for us between Paul's day and ours. Ruins of the city walls, stadium, and baths can also be seen underneath the vegetation here.
At Troas one night, Paul had a dream of a Macedonian who stood on the shore and raised his hands and said, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." Now, Macedonia was the land immediately north of Greece, which gave the world the famous King Philip II, who was the father of an even more famous king, Alexander the Great. Paul had no doubt whatever that the vision was heaven-inspired, and it changed his plans. Immediately, writes Luke, we tried to cross over to Macedonia, being convinced that God had called us to proclaim the good news to them. Here, of course, is the famous we passage. Up to now, Luke has used the third person, he or they, but now he switches to we, implying that he had joined at Troas the group that consisted now of Paul and Silas, Timothy, and Luke. What Luke was doing there, where his home was, and other personal details about the man we just don't know, other than this: he was a Greek Gentile who was a physician by training. For now, he would join the other missionaries, but in the future, he would write 2 of the 66 books in the Bible, the Gospel bearing his name and the Book of Acts. In the future, he would make incalculable contributions to Christianity in general and to Paul in particular.
The 4 sailed across the northeastern corner of the Aegean Sea to the island of Samothrace. The famed statue of the winged victory would one day be discovered there. And then on to Macedonia, landing at the port of Neapolis. Today, the place is called Kavala, and the Greek citizens here are proud of the fact that this was Christianity's first step onto the continent of Europe. The 4 missionaries were aiming for Philippi, the most important city of the area. After climbing a steep coastal ridge and taking a last look at Neapolis, they went on to Philippi, 8 miles to the north, but now in ruins. The city had been founded by King Philip II of Macedonia, the father of Alexander the Great. Gold had been discovered in the mountain west of the city, so Philippi quickly became a boom town in the ancient world. In the plain below this mountain, years earlier, the armies of Antony and Octavian had defeated those of Brutus and Cassius in avenging Julius Caesar's assassination.
The main east-west Roman highway that ran from here to Italy was called the Via Egnatia, or the Egnatian Way, and ruins of this artery, the very roadway used by Paul and company in the second mission journey, can still be seen. It was part of a general road system of 50,000 miles, which the Romans engineered primarily for military purposes.
They were models of excellent road construction, with deep bases of tightly packed sand and gravel, over which was a pavement of hewn stones set in a gentle convex curve to drain the rain.
Paul would use many of these Roman roads. It's been estimated, in fact, that he put in a total of 18,000 miles in his various mission travels. We'll continue with Paul's second mission journey in the next segment.